are now live. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. This is the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee. Sorry, we're a bit late starting. We had a slight technical issue and a bit of confusion about the link to the Zoom call. Fortunately, tonight's agenda is not all that heavy, so hopefully there will be plenty of time to cover what we need to cover. First of all, I'm Councillor Paul Conlon, so I'm the chair of the committee. You can see on the screen the various other councillors who are members of the committee. Also, we have here Steve Barton, who is from planning, and Steve will be doing most of the talking this evening. And we have a council officer from Democratic Services who is providing administrative support to the meeting. And we also have a number of members of the public who are able to join the meeting. A couple of members of the public have indicated that they would like to speak to the meeting. So it is possible to do that. So you will be hearing from them later on. So I think that's all I need to say at this point by way of introduction. So I think we'll go through the agenda. First of all, apologies for absence and substitutions. Do we have any apologies?
Thank you. There are none on this occasion. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just say, as a Councillor Woodruff, I have a scrutiny committee at 7, so I'm going to have to leave slightly before 7, so about 5 minutes or so before then.
Okay, and I believe Councillor Martin also has to leave early. She sort of notified us.
Yes, that's right, Chair.
Yeah. So okay, so we'll accept those two apologies. Okay, if that's all, then that's the apologies. Urgent matters. Well, I haven't been notified of any urgent matters. Has anyone got any urgent matters that they feel need to be addressed? Okay, so declarations of interest. Do any councillors want to make any sort of declaration of interest?
Sorry, Paul, it's about the last one. I'll put my hand up. Can I just check? Sorry. Can I just check, is this being put on YouTube or not for other people, for residents to see?
Yes, I understand that it is. Yes, we've got.
It is, thank you, because somebody's just asked me if it is. Thank you. Sorry, I missed that. Thanks very much.
Okay. Right, so if there's nothing else in the way of urgent matters, it's I think it's next. It's minutes of the last meeting. So the minutes have been circulated. Does anyone have any points? That the last meeting was, I have to say, it was back in December of 2020. So I don't know how good. Who was at that meeting? I know that I was, or how good people's memory is. But does anyone have any issues on that they wish to raise?
I was there, Chair, and I'm happy to agree them.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Shaw. Does anyone else have anything that they want to say on the minutes? Okay, are we happy to approve the minutes of the last meeting?
Agreed.
Okay, thanks. So, right, having got those sort of formalities out of the way, let's move on to the main business of the meeting. We have got a paper here on Ealing Council's local development plan update. The paper falls into sort of two sections, really, which I propose to take separately. I think the first part is actually the bit that's concerned with the local plan update. So Steve Barton will introduce that, and I think first of all Steve will start off with a general sort of update on developments in the planning world since our last meeting in December, to bring us all up to date, and then we'll talk about where we are with the local development plan and what the proposals are to move forward. So what the next steps are in the revision of the local plan. So after Steve's done that, I suggest that we then hear from the two members of the public who've said they'd like to speak. So they'll get 3 minutes each to make their contribution, and then we take questions and discussion on the local plan, and that will be the main item of the meeting. And then when we've finished that we look at the future work programme for this committee, and discuss that. Discuss that after we've discussed the local plan issues. So if that's acceptable to people, I plan to proceed on that basis.
Yes, accepted. Chair, we are happy with this.
Okay, well, you're speaking on behalf of the whole committee there, Councillor Mahmood, I hope.
Yes,
agreed by me.
And it's agreed by Councillor Woodruff as well, so that's great. Yeah. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. So, okay then, so I'll hand over to Steve Barton then to bring us up to date on planning and the local development plan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and a very good evening to everybody. Seva, could we load the slide deck, please? So just to introduce myself while that's happening, I'm Steve Barton. Hopefully you all know me. I'm Strategic Planning Manager, so I'm tasked with the responsibility of bringing forward a new local plan for Ealing Local Planning Authority. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Seva. What I'll cover during the course of this short introduction is firstly just to remind everyone why local plans are important, why they matter, why I think your role is absolutely vital, why you matter. I'll then provide a very brief update on some of the developments since you last met in terms of national and regional planning policy and any implications that might have for the emerging local plan. I think I'll pause, Chair, with your permission at that point, just to see if there's any points of clarification or questions that the committee have, before then moving on to the second half of my presentation, where I'll talk about where we are with Ealing's local development plan, particularly the format, structure, evidence base, the timetable. I thought, in deference to our guests, that I would also give you an update on the AMR as well. And then obviously, as you've already indicated, Chair, the most important decision for you to make tonight is around your future draft work programme. This, of course, is a second cycle of LDAP meetings. The first took place between 2019 to the end of 2020. We've had a bit of an interregnum, mainly as a result of COVID and uncertainty caused by the planning bill, but that work programme is going to propose another 6 meetings after this, with quite an action-packed and exciting programme, I hope, of theme discussions to take us forward into the spring of next year. So if I can have the next slide then. So why do local plans matter? Well, clearly, obviously, they are central to the entire planning system. They set out the vision, the framework for the future development of an area, setting targets for development, for infrastructure, for safeguarding the environment, and how we adapt to things like climate change and secure good design. Clearly, obviously, a good local plan is one that's kept up to date, which is flexible, which is able to deal with circumstances around radical uncertainty, for want of a better phrase, although none of us perhaps quite anticipated the events of the last 18 months. They're obviously crucial in deciding decisions about individual development proposals. They provide the guide to your colleagues on planning committee in terms of how they determine individual planning applications. And they also provide a measure of certainty and confidence for future investment and growth, and for local communities and stakeholders in terms of how you will make key decisions in the planning system. The next slide, please, Seva. According to the National Planning Policy Framework, they must include a set of strategic policies which address our priorities for the development and use of land in our area. And a strategic plan can be produced in one of two ways, either through joint or individual local plans, or through a spatial development strategy, which is produced by an elected mayor or a combined authority. So indeed, both of the limbs of that particular policy in the NPPF apply here. And then, for the avoidance of doubt, if you thought you had a choice in the matter, it is a legal obligation under the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. Next slide, please. I thought it was worth just reminding ourselves what the function of the advisory committee is. As somebody's already mentioned it, this is not a decision-making body as such, but it's certainly no less important because of that. And these were the terms of reference that your committee agreed back in 2018, when the now leader, Councillor Mason, chaired the committee. The functions really are, most importantly, to look at what proposals, what policies we include in the local plan, to keep abreast of what is happening at regional and national level and what implications they may have for the local plan, to examine the process of preparing the proposals, very significantly to consider community involvement in the local plan. And certainly there is considerable ambition, both on the part of my team and indeed the administration, for us to invest significant resources in having not just a conversation with local communities and key stakeholders, but to ensure there is detailed involvement and participation in the process. Equally, the committee monitors the performance of the local plan. Certainly the role of the AMR is one such facet. We must also address equality, diversity issues. And the most important function of the committee, therefore, is to make recommendations to Cabinet through the various portfolio holders, or indeed to full council as appropriate. So this, for me, is a really, really important committee. It enables me to get the views of elected members, for you to help shape the emerging local plan. Next slide, please, Seva. And again, just reflecting on objectives, these were the 4 objectives that Councillor Mason proposed for this committee, again back in 2018. So again, just to remind everyone while we're here, it's so that you'll have a better understanding of planning policy issues and the framework in which we work, to have an appreciation, obviously, of the administration's priorities and how that translates through either manifesto, corporate or service planning issues into the local plan, so that you have a better understanding of the many key debates that will help shape the local plan and the built environment, to try and attempt to, I don't think we'll always succeed, but attempt to settle some of the debates through the use of the evidence base, which I shall go on to talk about later, which sits behind the local plan, and to give you an opportunity to consider how we can increase the diversity of voices that contribute to place shaping in the borough. So, how it's not just about the content of the local plan, it's also about how we consult and how we ensure participation that's genuinely representative of the diversity breadth geographically of the borough. So I thought it's just useful just to remind ourselves of some of those important matters. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but again, just to remind yourself of what the process of local plan making is. So we are very much stuck on the first one of those boxes, evidence gathering. So we're at the very, very early stage of production, and we're building towards what will be our first formal public and stakeholder consultation, Reg 18, or initial proposals, as I prefer to call it. We in fact will be inserting something new and additional between those two stages, because as we've already been doing, for example, in relation to conservation area character appraisals and management plans, we want to do some consultation with the local communities about some of the very broad issues that will impact on the local plan, and have a conversation. We've certainly been doing that with many of the community interest groups on various local plan issues, such as tall buildings, for example. And we want to have some more of that in the lead up to that first formal stage of public consultation, so that perhaps there'll be fewer surprises about the scope and nature of the local plan once we get to a formal round of consultation. The next stage after that is more of a technical round of consultation, Reg 19, or what we call final proposals. This is the plan that the council would like to adopt, left to its own devices, so it must be approved by your governance decision-making bodies, the cabinet, or whichever bodies you mandate. And that document will be subject to a further round of public and stakeholder consultation before being submitted to the Secretary of State. Of course, we now know for levelling up housing and communities, the new title following the recent reshuffle. And we're not able to make changes to the plan at that stage. The only changes that can be made will be by an independent inspector appointed by the Secretary of State. And the inspector will be checking to make sure the plan is obviously compliant with national planning policy and is in general conformity with the London plan as well. And we go through a very exhaustive process of examination, or public inquiry, if you like, where those who've registered an interest can make representations at the inquiry itself, can be heard, and the inspector reflects on everything that we've said, the draft plan, comments and representations that have been made, and our reaction, and produces a report. And their recommendations are pretty much, to all intents and purposes, binding on the local authority. And you then have a decision to make at full council, which is to adopt the local plan or not. And this happens also alongside a number of other very key processes, which we'll again talk about in future committees. A process of integrated impact assessment, where we assess any local plan proposals, in particular whether or not they are sustainable. We assess their health impacts. We also assess equalities and diversity impacts. And there are some other technical impacts in relation to something called the Habitats Regulations Assessment. And we have to produce a final integrated impact assessment when the local plan is submitted to the Secretary of State. And then the last box is the feedback loop, where we are assessing the performance of individual local plan policies and reviewing that in something called the Authorities Monitoring Report. We'll come back to that again later. Next slide. So that's a bit of a sort of very fast sort of summary of sort of the background, just to bring members up to date, and particularly some of the new members on the committee. This next segment then is just to update you on some of the key changes since you last met in terms of national planning policy and regional planning policy. And of course, I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with the Planning for the Future white paper that was published actually in the summer of last year. And some of the key proposals included local communities being consulted from the very beginning of the planning process, harnessing the latest technology through online maps and data, trying to make the whole system more accessible, that valued green spaces will be protected for future generations by allowing for more building on brownfield land and more tree planting, in particular street trees, that much needed homes will be built faster by ensuring that local plans are developed and agreed more quickly in 30 months, down from the current on average 7 years to produce a local plan, that every area would have a local plan in place. Currently, in fact, only 50% of local planning authorities actually possess a plan to build more homes, and the government is making great store by its very ambitious national targets for housing delivery. The planning process was to be overhauled and replaced with what it called a clearer rules-based system. That's code for things like design codes and for greater use of what is known as, in effect, planning permission in principle, designating areas, for example, for growth. A new, simpler national levy to replace the current system of planning obligations. This, of course, would have had a very severe impact, particularly in London and in the home counties. The creation of a fast track system for beautiful buildings. I'm not quite sure how we define beautiful in this context, but anyway, establishing local design guidance for developers to build and preserve beautiful communities, and that all new homes were to be zero carbon ready, with no new homes delivered under the new system needing to be retrofitted to achieve a commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Now, I've chosen my words very carefully because much of that text is borrowed from the government's own press release describing its proposals. It has to be said, the reaction from the planning profession, and indeed from many communities and other key stakeholders with interest in the planning committee, was pretty hostile in some quarters. And in fact, I'm told more than 40,000 representations were made on the planning white paper itself. We go to the next slide. And just to remind people what Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said in the foreword to the planning white paper, I thought I'd remind ourselves of what he said. I mean, the ambition of government was very, very clear. He wanted to tear down the existing planning system and start again, not fiddle around the edges. He wanted a whole new planning system for England. That's what he said back in August of last year. Now, we were anticipating both a response to the representations made on the planning white paper in the summer. That was then subsequently delayed to the autumn. We're still expecting that before Christmas. We were also expecting a draft planning bill to be published around about now. You'll be aware of the change in the Prime Minister's ministerial team and the advent of Gove to the Secretary of State now for the Levelling Up department. So certainly the speculation in the professional press and in the broadsheets is that a draft planning bill is going to be delayed, and many commentators are suggesting we're unlikely now to see a draft planning bill until the new year. So still much speculation as to what it may contain and what direction of travel the government will take. So this is clearly, obviously, cause for great uncertainty for us who are trying to produce a local plan when potentially the system could be upended or radically changed. So that is certainly something which we need to consider in terms of our risk log. In terms of, next slide please, Seba. Almost forgotten because the planning white paper captured all the headlines. At the same time last year, there was a consultation on quite significant changes to the current planning system. Most of these were quite sort of techie stuff. First, starter homes, which I think you've seen some proposals on, the thresholds for developer contributions, the principle of permission in principle, and the standard method for calculating housing need. The government, I think, has now published some further information on first homes. We're going to deal with that at one of our future meetings in some detail, so I won't make any remarks about that now, but I just wanted to say something about the standard method for calculating housing need. You may be aware that the government on the 16th of December, just before Christmas, published its response, its reaction to the many representations made on this, alongside a written ministerial statement, and the government response said that it heard the concerns included in Parliament, that the distribution of need was not right, and it wanted towns and cities to emerge from the pandemic renewed and strengthened. The government therefore confirmed that it wasn't going to proceed with the changes set out in the consultation. And the government instead amended the current standard method by adding a 35% uplift to the post-cap numbers, which it generates both for Greater London and the local authorities that contain the largest proportion of the most populated cities, urban centres in England. So that now effectively sets a housing delivery target for Ealing in excess of more than 3,000 net new homes per annum, more than 3,000 net new homes per annum, which in my judgment is completely unrealistic and frankly speaking, I think quite undeliverable. And again, this will be a theme that we will return to at one of your future meetings when we will spend the evening talking about housing and the implications this might have for target setting in the local plan. In the summer of this year, government also issued a revised national planning policy framework, which also incorporated a raft of changes to permitted development rights, including revisions to the general permitted development order. And these included new permitted development rights to allow change of use from the new use class E, commercial, business and service, to C3, residential, amended permitted development rights for the extension of schools, for colleges, for universities, hospitals, and other public infrastructure improvements, such as prisons. Faster decisions and applications for planning permission, reducing the statutory period for determination, and in particular those which require an EIA. Other PDRs, permitted development rights, were consolidated and simplified, and new rules on upward extensions were implemented as well. So a number of very, very key changes in terms of the national planning policy framework. Next slide, please, Seva. There's also been very important changes to our regional planning policy framework, not least after some considerable delay, a new London plan finally published on March the 2nd of this year, after a bit of football between the then Secretary of State and the Mayor, but finally paving the way to adoption. And this new London plan entirely replaces earlier iterations of the plan. And again, just to remind everyone, the London plan is the strategic plan for London. It sets out the overarching development targets for London for development over the next 25 years. And again, just to remind everyone, you know, we already have part of our local plan agreed and adopted, because the London plan is part of each and every local planning authority's development plan in London. And one of the things that will be tested on is that our local development plan must be in general conformity with the London plan. And it runs to 600 odd pages, so it's a very comprehensive document covering a lot of matters in incredible detail, I have to say, including now, for example, on design, which was perhaps an area that was missing in earlier iterations. And so planning applications then now must be determined in accordance with the London plan, unless there are sound planning reasons or other material considerations which would suggest otherwise. Next slide. I won't talk through this one, but I mean, just to remind people the structure and format of the London plan. After the forward, you have chapters which deal with the 6 core good growth principles, the spatial development plan, and then a series of topic-based policies and a section on implementation with a number of annexes. Next slide, please. And then again, just to remind people that when we talk about Ealing's local plan, we are not talking about a local plan that encompasses the whole of the geography of Ealing Council, because since 2015, something called the Old Oak and Park Royal Mayoral Development Corporation, which was set up by the former mayor and now Prime Minister, was established, and the OPDC has responsibility for plan making within its boundaries in the northeastern corner, northeastern area of the borough, and we expect them to adopt their local plan sometime in 2022. I think it's also just highlighting another organisation, although it's not a statutory one, and that is the work that was done by the Heathrow Strategic Planning Group, again set up in 2015, comprising 16 other organisations, including the council, to enable a sub-regional conversation about the future of Heathrow Airport. And just before the pandemic, literally weeks before the pandemic really took root, they published a non-statutory joint strategic planning framework for the area, quite a considerable achievement given the differing political affiliations of the member authorities. Clearly, obviously, events have in part overtaken us on that, not least because any plans for expansion of Heathrow Airport have been firmly kicked into the long grass. But HSPG still exists, and they are taking the opportunity to update the strategic plan to take account of changing circumstance. And indeed, the leader chaired a leaders forum only in the last couple of weeks. Chair, with your permission, perhaps I'll just pause there just for a moment to see if there's any points of clarification or questions on what I've said so far before I then talk about Ealing's local plan itself.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Is there anyone who has any questions on that?
Sorry, Chair, can I just, talking about the whole discussion or presentation, can we get the question now, or you want to talk only, you want to get the question only from Ealing local plan?
Well, just questions on what Steve has just covered. So
Yeah.
really on the national and London sort of planning policy framework. So then he'll do the rest of he'll cover the more Ealing specific stuff.
Well,
you know.
Yeah. All right. Two things.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. See, can you clarify that when you said Secretary of State nominate officer to monitor our local plan, and so would that be officer will be monitoring, the one designated officer will be monitoring our local plan throughout from beginning to end? No,
sorry if I've confused you. Chair, if I can come back straight away. So basically what I was describing was the process of examination or public inquiry. So once you have, and we're still some way off of that, once we've got to the stage where we think we have a final draft plan, one that you would ideally want to promote and to adopt, we would subject that to a round of public and stakeholder consultation. That's got to be for a minimum of 6 weeks. And then we would submit that together with any representations that we've received to the Secretary of State, and he would appoint a planning inspector from the planning inspectorate based in Bristol. And his or her job will be to review our local plan. I'll go on to describe the process, but to make sure that it is legally compliant, it ticks all the boxes in terms of what we are required to do when we make a local plan. Did we consult? Did we comply with the habitats regulation assessments? Are we in general conformity with the London plan? Are we in conformity with national planning policy? And it will test the soundness of the plan. Is the evidence which we have based that plan on, enabling us to draw the conclusions in policy terms? And so that will be a very open, very transparent process, a very thorough and very detailed process. It can last anything from 6 to 12 months. I and my team will be grilled, I can assure you. And of course, members of the public and other key stakeholders from the business community, from statutory bodies, etc., may also attend and can also offer differing points of view. And the inspector, having heard all of that evidence and the reaction from the local authority, will go away, reflect on that, and write a report. Now, obviously, worst case scenario is they say, we haven't done a good enough job. we failed to meet the tests. You do not pass go. And we could be directed to withdraw the plan or to make substantial amendment to the plan. Obviously, we've never been in that position before. We've been through 5 adoptions, 5 examinations in the last 10 years, and we've managed to succeed in all of those. So one would hope the inspector's report will then say, yep, subject to some minor modifications, the plan can be adopted. And then we will then report that to full council, and then the final decision then rests with you at full council to formally implement the local plan. So it's only for that period of examination after we produce the final plan up to and preceding the point when you adopt the local plan that we have this external person reviewing our homework, if you like.
Right. Thanks for clarification, Steve. The second quickly thing, could you describe that? You said every area have a local plan in place. So when you said every area, mean what? Every region, every ward, every constituency? So can you clarify that?
Right, so it's every local planning authority, although of course that is further complicated where you have different arrangements. So in the case of London, we have an elected mayor, and that's certainly the case in the West Midlands, in Greater Manchester, etc. And where the mayor has been given planning responsibilities, they can produce something called the Spatial Development Strategy. So in London, we know that as the London Plan. So that will be the overarching strategic plan for the conurbation, in this case, London. So that sits alongside our own local plan. It is part of our local plan. And so the bit that we write must take account of what the London plan is saying. We can't just ignore it. I'm about to come. So basically, in terms of the London plan, we can either just set those policies that we've been directed to do by the mayor, because he requires us in the London plan to have a policy on. So, for example, the London plan has a policy D9, which is on tall buildings, which says the local authority must decide what will be the most appropriate suitable locations for tall buildings within its area. So we're directed to do that, and it's up to us then to come up with the evidence base and suggest possible locations, for example. We're not entirely slavish to the London plan, because as we did last time, we can go further, providing the evidence justifies and supports our approach. So an area, for example, where we have great ambition and where we were very successful in doing more last time was around energy efficiency, where London plan set some very exacting targets, but we decided they weren't good enough. We set tougher targets, and certainly amongst the proposals we're bringing forward in the coming months will be to do much the same this time again, so that we will be leading that, and providing the evidence, of course, supports taking a different approach.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Mahmood. Does anyone else have any questions? Please put your hand up or shout out.
Yeah, I do have my hand up, Chair.
I'm not sure why I'm not noticing people's hands up, but okay. Okay, Councillor Shaw, please go ahead. Yeah.
Perhaps it's not coming up for some reason. Sorry, Chair. Yeah, just very briefly, Steve, you just touched on the national planning policy framework and the actual figure setting, if you like, and how that cap had been removed and was uplifted by government in its announcements, and that it was over 3,000 new properties. I think it's quite important just to explain if we have a right to not conform with that. If we were to say, actually, we know you're saying that you want 3,000, but we're actually only going to build 1,000, what would be the consequences of that? Just so it's clear for everybody, please.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And in fact, we're going to have a whole meeting just discussing that as part of your program, if you agree that later. So, I mean, my professional judgment, as I was indicating, is that I think a target of that order of magnitude is unlikely to be realistic or deliverable in the short, medium, or even the longer term, quite frankly. And certainly, I believe, and we're in the process of obviously assembling the evidence, that the evidence that we put to the committee will confirm that. Certainly, when we've looked at our own strategic housing market assessment that we produced, I have to say, pre-pandemic, it was suggesting that the need figure was certainly a lot lower. Obviously, we need to reassess that, and one of the things that we will be doing will be an update to that strategic housing market assessment. We're also doing some work around sites assessment and spatial optioneering, looking at, what is the possibilities in terms of achieving a rapid uplift in development quantums, both on big sites and indeed on small sites. And certainly the evidence that we have at the moment is suggesting those sorts of targets, again, are unrealistic. Now, we are commissioning further evidence to confirm those hypotheses. We certainly will leave no stone unturned, but it creates a bit of a conundrum, as you've rightly identified, because clearly, obviously, if you're not meeting targets in certain circumstances, it is possible for developers to argue that because you're not meeting targets, that the presumption of sustainable development, which sits within the main body of the MPPF, applies, and therefore, on appeal, they will attempt to argue that planning permissions, which your planning committee, perhaps for very good reasons, perhaps on design grounds, for example, have refused, might be overturned. Now, I say may, because of course the devil is always in the detail. And again, there's something else which is called the housing delivery test, which you may have heard of, where the government was attempting to turn the screws on local planning authorities, particularly those that have a poor track record of delivery. Now, I have to say Ealing isn't one of those. We are in that 50% of local authorities which actually plan to deliver more housing. There are many local planning authorities across the land that don't think providing more homes is strategically important. And because the government has set such a exacting situation where those of us who are putting our shoulders to the wheel are having to work that much harder, because perhaps some of our colleagues in some parts of the country, particularly the home counties, perhaps are not providing as much. Of course, these arguments are never simple or straightforward. Again, one of the other meetings we will be discussing green infrastructure and green belt MOL policy, for example. That certainly has been a major restriction on the ability of many authorities in the southeast to be able to deliver higher quantities of housing. That I don't think is necessarily an issue in this authority, and it's not certainly something that we will be advocating. But clearly, obviously, if we are going to propose a different target to the one that government is currently proposing, we need to have the evidence to support it. My own personal judgment is that government's assessment of housing need now becomes so heavily politicised as to be almost meaningless as a target to guide local plan, and therefore we are reliant on our own evidence base and the utility of that in terms of guiding what targets that we then set. And so the London plan, which we can't ignore, sets a target which is more modest. I have to say the Mayor was looking for a target which was to the upper echelons of the 2000s. I think we've ended up at 2,157 off the top of my head as our net target. I think I'm on record as saying pre-pandemic that was ambitious and challenging, but potentially deliverable. I think COVID means that we're already playing catch up because we've not been able to achieve those levels. I think our best year, we achieved 1,815 net additional homes. So we're still falling short of even the more modest London plan target.
Paul, I've got my hand up. Is that
okay? Sorry, I can't see hands up and not going on my screen. So yeah, people will have to shout out. So yeah, please go ahead, Councillor Burke.
Thank you. A couple of very diverse points. The first one is, Steve, and forgive me if I missed it, in all of that answer, I still didn't really get what the consequences for us would be of that. I mean, putting aside the fact we need more houses, which obviously is really, really important, I still didn't get would anything punitive happen to us as a result of that, given how many local authorities don't meet their target. The second point is that how do we balance things that we know are going to become more important that are already in both the government and London plan? And the one that really jumps out, of course, is about climate change. And I think we can all predict that that is going to be a driver that's much more to the forefront and, will have consequences in terms of should have consequences in terms of our planning. So it's how we balance that. And the third one is going to be a really, really practical thing. Steve, I'm very conscious that this meeting is very squash for time. So, Paul, as a future suggestion, could perhaps could we have the slides ahead, and could we have the opportunity to send questions ahead? So some of them might be able to be written to us before, because these are just such big things, and lots of people will have questions.
Okay, thanks. I don't see why we can't do that where people are able to provide the slides in advance. So perhaps, Katie, if you could minute that as a recommendation that we would like, where possible, to have slides to be circulated in advance of the meeting.
Yeah,
we have got a paper, but I accept that the paper and that the slides are not necessarily always totally in alignment.
I mean, certainly I can undertake that, to do that for my team. Obviously, again, subject to your agreement later, we obviously want to invite a number of external speakers as well. So it's not just me and my team talking to you, that we are able to get experts in the field, and particularly some of those who've assembled bits of our evidence base to talk. But where we're able to, certainly we'll try and facilitate that.
And similarly, sorry. If we could, then if we can have the opportunity to submit obvious questions beforehand, it may be that some of those can be written and dealt with, if they're very practical things.
Well, I would say more generally, if members do have questions, don't wait for committee. Please send them to me, and we'll endeavour to answer them. We're here to help and assist in the process. So if there are issues of concern or things which you don't understand, we want to be able to assist you in that process. So happy to do that.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Burke. First of all, are there any? I've got a member of the public who wants to ask a question. Are there any other councillors that want to ask a question? So please shout out or put the hand up in case I see it. Okay, I don't have any more questions from councillors. So Libby Kemp, please.
I think we've built something like 35,000, or are in the process of building 35,000 housing units since 2015, but we've still got the same amount of people on the waiting list and more people who are homeless. How do we work out what houses we need for the people who are in London, and how do we separate those from those that are built for investment? And do we know how many of the 35,000 have been completed that are taken over by investments for Airbnbs and things like that? How do we make sure we are building for the people of Ealing, or does that not matter?
Well, firstly, can I just say I don't recognise that figure in terms of completions, and I think there's
it's
a conflation here.
Database.
Well, there's a conflation between planning
okay.
permissions and completions and starts are three very different things. It's very important to understand the difference.
I do understand the difference. It's just a figure, Steve, but we know we've built a lot of homes and have started to build a lot of homes in the last 6 years. And we know that we still got about the same amount of people on the housing waiting list and are homeless. How do we put it right for the people in Ealing so that what we are building is actually for the needs of the people in the borough and people who want to come and live and work in the borough, rather than investment properties, which we've got all over Film Works, Dickens Yard, various other places?
Yeah, well, setting aside the issues around the data, let's agree to disagree on that. Actually, the main part of your question actually is really profound and really, really important. Again, speaking professionally, personally, I think the obsession with volumetric housing targets, particularly by government, is wrong-headed. I think that's the wrong way to go. I'm not professionally opposed to mandating nationally set targets. In fact, it's often been argued that's the only way in which you actually see any serious housing delivery nationwide, because there are, as I've already indicated, parts of the country which are determined not to see any large-scale housing development.
Agreed.
So the issue, which I think you've raised, is how do we build more generally affordable homes? And I think that's the nub of the issue. And one of the problems we've had as an authority, and it's caused great consternation and controversy on planning committee, and Councillor Conlon's colleagues, I think, have a really, really difficult job balancing all of these issues, is that sometimes to get a modest or reasonable quantum of affordable housing, you need ever larger quantities of housing to be built, which are for private sale or for products which are not generally affordable, to get some crumbs, if you like. And that is the dilemma. We are going to have a meeting which is going to deal with this, and in particular some of the initiatives around affordable housing at one of the future meetings. But I'll just finish on this last point. I don't deny that housing is a really important issue. It's a real challenge for us, but the local plan is more than just housing.
Yeah.
You know, we have to consider lots of other issues. We need to talk about jobs. We need to talk about infrastructure. And I'm really glad you highlighted climate change. And certainly that will be the key golden thread, the glue, in my opinion, that will go through the entire local plan. And that will be the true acid test. And, you know, that will affect housing, it will affect industry, it will affect infrastructure, and a whole raft of other planning policies. So we need to get away from the obsession that local plans is just about housing numbers, which is, I think, why I think the NPPF is wrong-headed.
Yeah. But what I want to say is we are building houses on land that used to be employment land, industrial land, and we're losing all that. And Peter Mason did say he didn't want this to be a dormitory borough. He wanted it where people lived and worked. And yet we've built most of Southall, which is industrial commercial, most of the Southern Park is Park Royal, OPDC, a lot of Acton Estate. It's all now housing, and all the employment has gone from there. So I understand just as much as you do that we need to do work as well as housing. But I am concerned about, and I realise we have to build private housing to subsidise the public sector housing, but I just think maybe we haven't got the balance right. We're not building for families, which is what our borough has always been noted to be, a family borough.
Well, I mean, just to say, I actually agree with some of the sentiments you made in terms of employment land. And again, we've got a special meeting which will be just devoted just to that topic. But just to come back to the data, my own information in front of me is, you know, we've built since 2015, so we've completed since 2015, something less than 9,000 net additional homes in the borough. So a big difference from the figure that you were quoting, I'm afraid.
It was permissions, sorry.
Well, again, you know, not all permissions necessarily translate into completions. As you will be aware, we get quite a lot of speculative development proposals. You have schemes which will come back in with different iterations. Some of these schemes never get built at all. In fact, Moliere did some research for the mayor. I think both the old mayor and the new one. And I think the first study showed that something like 50% of planning permissions, this is across Greater London, by the way, were obtained by people with a track record of building little or nothing. And a subsequent report put the figure slightly lower to around 30%. So that's the scale of the problem. If you're relying, you know, as a planner, I should perhaps use my performance figure as permissions, because that's something which obviously I have some influence over, but not all those permissions translate into delivery. Yet it's the delivery figure that's used to judge the success or failure of the planning system. And unless I send my team off to do carpentry and plastering, I'm not quite sure what else I can do. But anyway. Chair, shall I move on to the next part of my presentation then? So, yes, Seva, could I have the slide deck back up, please? Thank you very much. So if we go to the next slide, sorry. Oh. Thank you. So just to remind people, we currently have 5 development plan documents, which comprise our existing local plan, as I say, plus the London plan. You know, just to remind you of what they are. We go to the next slide. And the proposal is that we will reconsolidate all of those separate individual development plan documents back into one local plan, with the exception of the plan for waste. And we are working with our neighbouring authorities in West London, and indeed the West London Waste Authority, on developing a new waste plan in due course. And because waste streams go beyond borough boundaries, I think it makes more sense to do that on a more strategic sub-regional basis. But the other 4 DPDs would in effect be reconsolidated back into one London plan. So if we go on to the next slide. So the local plan in effect will be divided into 4 broad parts. The first is the overarching, if you like, vision, development strategy. This must take into account the duty to cooperate, although those of you in the know will know the planning white paper did talk about abolishing the duty to cooperate, but without actually setting out how strategic planning matters will be dealt with across borough boundaries. So a real strategic planning deficit, if you like. But we actually have to say in West London have a very proud tradition of working collaboratively with our neighbours. In fact, quite a large chunk of our evidence base has been produced on a West London basis, A, because it makes more sense, B, because it also saves us some money. So the first part of the plan is the development strategy. Next slide, please. In terms of page count, probably the biggest part of the plan will be part 2, which is basically the section that will deal with development sites and our town or place plans. This is, in technical terms, the set of site allocations that we designate in the local plan, which we believe will enable us to meet our various development targets, either set out in the London plan or in our own strategy. Interestingly, you'll recall that we had a separate development plan document for new schools. We won't be doing that as a separate document. That will now be subsumed into this section of the plan. And the intention is that each of those groupings of site allocations will reflect the broad neighbourhood geographies of the borough. I've said 6 here, that actually should have said 7 or 8, depending on how you count it. So that as well as the site allocations for that particular geography, there will then be an overarching narrative, a place or a town plan, which will describe the challenges, the opportunities that those local areas face, but also how change itself will manifest itself, reflecting local priorities, in particular for the spending of various planning obligations. Next slide, please. The third part of the plan will then be development management, and I take pride in the fact that this section of our existing local plan is probably the shortest in London. Certainly my colleagues in planning services are very grateful because they, as I said already have 600 pages in the London plan, plus a whole raft of other guidance in supplementary planning guidance to read. So our view here is that this is the additional information that colleagues will need to guide development, to help your members on planning committee determine planning applications where either there is no policy in the London plan or it's not clear or comprehensive. So these are the criteria-based policies that we might use. And I'm pleased to say that some of the policies in the London plan that have come in, for example, on protection of pubs, on fast food takeaways near schools, those are all policies we used to have in our old local plan. We probably won't need them in the new local plan because the London plan is already covering those issues in policy. And the last part of the local plan is what we call the adopted policies map, and it basically is a geographical expression of all of those 3 separate parts of the plan. Next slide. So we've already got into some of this from the debate and from the very helpful intervention of Libby earlier. So what are the key challenges? And again, apologies here for just reflecting on what Councillor Mason said when he chaired LDAP and kicked off the first cycle of LDAP meetings. He was very clear that he wanted us to respond to some of the big challenges that lie ahead. So yes, are there enough homes being built? Is there enough space for employment? Are we protecting and enhancing our green spaces? Are our transport networks fit for purpose? Have we got the right infrastructure? Are we maximising those opportunities? What about our high streets, our town centres? Are we conserving our heritage? And are we also engaging residents and involving them in the shaping of the future of their place? I will perhaps be bold enough to suggest, obviously, that these sentiments were expressed pre the pandemic, that clearly, obviously, public health has become obviously a key priority and key concern. And again, that will be a key part of the narrative in the local plan alongside climate change and inclusive growth as the three sort of cross-cutting themes across the local plan. And the next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just to give you a flavour of the amount of background information that we need to assemble to inform the local plan making process. Some of these things then you will be very familiar with. So they deal with things like housing need, housing supply, the stock of industrial land, the state of our town centres, flood risk, infrastructure and so forth, design guides. So there's a considerable body of work that has already been assembled. Of course, the pandemic has changed some of the assumptions, some of the parameters in which we were working. So we are also planning to update some bits of this evidence, in particular housing need, as I've already described, certainly work around town centres and retail needs. And of course, we're now commissioning a bespoke study on health to further inform planning around infrastructure delivery. And the next slide, please. So we are behind the schedule that I originally published in our first cycle of meetings. And again, you know, apologies for that. It is partly down to the pandemic, but it's also because of the uncertainty generated by the machinations around the planning white paper and the uncertainty that's generated. And of course, because of the delays in getting a published London plan. But I'm confident that we can now realise the milestones that I've set out in this slide. So very shortly, hopefully in the next week or so, I'll publish our public project plan, which will set out this timetable, but in more detail. We're also in the process of revising our statement of community involvement, which is the document which says how we will consult and how we will engage. And I'm firmly of the view that there will be a step change, certainly compared to previous local plans that we've produced in Ealing, in terms of the effort, resource, and the diversity of responses that we will be seeking to capture in this process. The Reg 18 or initial proposals will happen. This is the first formal round of public and stakeholder consultation. It's now planned for the summer of next year. As I indicated earlier, my plan is to do some very high-level consultation before then around a number of issues and options and geographies in the borough. We've, for example, already been doing quite a lot of considerable work around conservation appraisals and management plans. And then the final proposals, Reg 19 as it's called technically, this is the plan that members would like to adopt if they were able, the one that we will submit. It must go through a technical round of consultation, and we plan to do that late spring, early summer 2023. To submit that then to the Secretary of State before the end of 2023, we must, as well as submitting the plan, we must submit any formal representations that are lodged by members of the local community, the public, or by other key stakeholders, business interests and so forth. We will then get into a process of examination. So in response to the question earlier from Councillor Mahmood, that is, if you like, the grand public inquiry, where members of the public and other stakeholders can register a right to speak and to make representations. And then, subject to the inspector finding our report, our local plan legally compliant and sound, and again, subject to full council agreeing, adopt the plan by autumn, that should be 2024. I'm not suggesting it should take us 1,000 years or 2,000 years, sorry, to get over that line. That's just a typo. Apologies. I would just add one other thing of import here, and again, this may change, but the planning white paper, of course, was looking to increase the pace by which local authorities make new plans. We're certainly not anywhere near amongst the worst in authority. York City, for example, hasn't had an adopted local plan since the mid-1950s. Anglesey, I think, has finally got over the line only recently, but after a hiatus of more than 50 years. So, yes, our local plan is ossifying, it's getting out of date, but it's certainly not as bad as by any means the worst in the country. And as I say, take some comfort that we have an important plank of our local plan already adopted in the form of the London plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of risks, what we've been effectively dealing with over the last 18 months is a period of complete radical uncertainty, and I suspect that ain't going to end anytime soon. But we certainly need to build in flexibility and resilience to the process. And I have to say, my colleagues and my senior management team have been very, very keen to ensure that we are better resourced for the work that needs to be done. Clearly, obviously, key risks are in the examination, failing to meet legal compliance tests. So if we produce a new local plan, we have to do it properly in compliance with the regulations, or we fail. We must also meet various tests of soundness. So the plan must be positively prepared, justified, effective, consistent with national policy. Tests of soundness can be repaired during the examination process up to a point, but legal compliance tests are fatal. Other issues outside our control, particularly capacity of the planning inspectorate to examine, may also impact on the programme. But the planning white paper sets us a target that we should have a plan submitted by the end of 2023. So I've now exhausted really all my get out of jail cards. We have to meet this timeline, or we risk not meeting that timeline. And there is the potential, I put it no more strongly than that because we don't know what sanctions might be applied, of the Secretary of State then applying penalties or even special measures. Now, as I say, I think there will be far more worse serial offenders out there, but I certainly, from a professional standpoint, wouldn't want to be on the naughty step, if you like. And then finally, and anticipating, next slide, please. Anticipating rightfully some questions that I think I'm probably going to get around the AMR. We are required to produce a monitoring report assessing the effectiveness of policies in our existing local plan, and it's not just important intrinsically, but it's also really important in our evidence-based work that we're developing now, and in producing a new local plan. We need to establish what is working and what is perhaps not working successfully so that we can plan accordingly. And the last AMR we published, to my eternal regret, was back in September 2015, covering the year 2013-14, and we are not up to date, and I must apologise for that. The publication of the AMR, which I had expected would happen at the back end of last year, has been delayed primarily through circumstances outside our control, following a data migration exercise led by City Hall at the GLA. So, that is having unintended consequences. Next slide, please. But, sorry, previous slide. But I can tell you that we will be publishing an interim AMR very shortly. It is a very comprehensive, a very fat document at the moment with quite a lot of numbers and stats and figures. And it will, I can assure you, cover the 5 years from 2014-15 to 2018-19. We can't produce more recent years because that will be subject to our annual starts and completions exercise, which is being undertaken as we speak, and will require some further survey work plus validation work by colleagues at City Hall. So we won't have the numbers that we can plug into a 2019-20 report until sometime early in the new year. But the interim report will cover 7 broad thematic chapters as I've outlined there. And then can I have the final slide, please? And then just to tee up the last part of your meeting, Chair, in the committee report that I've tabled, you're asked to discuss and to agree your work programme. I'm really excited about some of the things that we've got in store for you. So we have 6 further meetings which are going to cover design, climate action, green infrastructure, employment, housing, infrastructure delivery, and healthy lives. This is quite an ambitious programme. It's going to be quite a lot of work for my team and myself, but we will also be bringing in, as we did in the first cycle of LDAP meetings, experts in the various fields, plus some of the authors of the evidence base that we are assembling for you, so that you can get a better understanding of the evidence that supports the local plan and some of the options that present themselves for future planning policy. So thank you very much. Thank you for being very patient. I hope that was helpful, and more than happy to take any further questions.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Steve. Well, okay, we have got a couple of members of the public who wanted to speak. So maybe if they're each entitled to up to sort of 3 minutes, according to our protocol. So maybe if we take those first, and then we take any questions and general contributions, and Steve can also have a chance to respond to points raised from members of the public. And then when we've done that, we'll come back to the future work programme and just go through each of those items one by one, just to make sure that the committee is agreed that on that future work programme, and that you know, we'll move ahead on that basis. So I think we had 2 speakers wanted to indicate. One was Kay Garmson.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Kay, if you go ahead, and as I say, keep it within the 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak on behalf of Ealing Matters. I spoke at the last meeting of LDPAC in December last year. While the minutes were approved earlier, I wish to object to the fact that the content of my contribution was not recorded. I raised this with Councillor Sapiers, the Chair of LDPAC at the time, but to no avail. This is pertinent as what I have to say now relates to the same issues which are as if not more relevant now than they were then, namely the failure of Ealing to produce authority monitoring reports, or AMRs, since 2015, and the absence of an up-to-date local development scheme. With regard to AMRs, a promise was made in December to bring the reports up to date in early 2021. It's now the end of September and still no reports. The local government ombudsman has now found fault with the council, and I quote, because it did not fulfil its statutory duty to publish an AMR annually for the past 6 years. It has given the council 3 months to remedy this. We look forward to their publication, and that included 2019-20 figures. As we've said before, the importance of AMRs is if we don't know where we are in delivering the last local plan, as we don't, then how can we possibly plan where to go next? If this sounds academic, then consider the following downside of not producing AMRs, which is most definitely rooted in the real world. The decision on the Manor Road appeal is imminent. In his closing statement, the barrister for the appellant, Chris Katkowski QC, slammed Ealing Council for not having produced a 5-year housing land supply figure. He argued that the failure of the council to provide this projection, which is based on and part of the AMR, would require the planning inspector chairing the appeal to apply the tilted balance. In other words, a presumption in favour of development. The appellant has already applied for costs against Ealing Council in case the inspector rules in their favour. This is troubling not only because the council can ill afford to waste money in this way, but more importantly, for the deadening effect this could have on the planning committee's willingness to reject any future scheme proposed by a developer with deep pockets, all because the council did not fulfil its statutory duty. The second point I'd like to refer to is the local development scheme. I note that this will be published on the council's webpages by mid-October, and I look forward to seeing it. With this in mind, I'd like to put in a plea to this committee that a new webpage be created containing all the documents connected with the local plan, including the local development scheme, in one place. If the community is to be in the driving seat, then people must be able to find all the relevant information easily, even if they're unfamiliar with the subject matter. Other London boroughs have been able to achieve this. I strongly recommend that the council looks at the way Wandsworth has organised its local plan information. It's both concise and easy to navigate. Finally, I'd like to ask who is in charge of the process. Councillor Mason as leader, Councillor Manroe as cabinet portfolio holder for good growth, the LDPAC committee, all have responsibilities linked to the local plan, but who is the final decision maker? And specifically, whom does the community go to with questions, comments, or criticisms about the process, and who will respond? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think perhaps before I'll give Steve a chance to respond to that, but maybe if we could hear from Libby as well, because I suspect you may have some similar points maybe to raise. Or
no, I said that I would like the right to ask a question. I've asked my question, so I'm fine. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, you have. Okay, that's great. Okay. Well, before we move on then, Steve, do you want to say anything in response to Kay's contribution? Obviously, you have said a bit about the annual monitoring reports already, but if you want to add anything or respond to any of the other points.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, just in relation to the web pages, that is in the process of review, and so when we do launch the local development scheme, and indeed some of the other documents that I've referred to, hopefully you will see a revamp and certainly a major tidying up and housekeeping exercise of the web pages, and certainly as part of the high-level consultation engagement work that we intend to do in the coming months, certainly before our first formal round of public and stakeholder consultation. We're also going to be taking advantage of other technological innovations as a way of getting information out there. So watch your space. I'm going to tease you a little bit now, and possibly at the next LDAP meeting we'll be able to do a bit more of a reveal about some of the plans that are in the pipeline. On the issue about, you know, who to come to with problems, issues, concerns, well, certainly I, on behalf of the local plans team, have always responded to any queries or concerns that are addressed to me, and certainly I've certainly spoken to people in the room and to other absent friends, and do so on a very regular basis, and more than happy to do so. And I repeat the assurance that I've given that, you know, if you want me to attend other meetings of community interest or what have you, I and my colleagues stand ready and waiting to be able to accommodate any reasonable request. So over the summer, but unfortunately I did fall victim to COVID, so that there was a period of a few short weeks when my usual response times weren't quite up to the normal standard that perhaps you're used to. But in terms of politicians, I think I have to defer to you, Chair. I know that you know, members have expressed great interest in the local plan, and I'm also inundated with questions, queries, points of concern from elected members, and long may that continue. Indeed, I was inviting further comment in response to a question from Councillor Burke earlier on exactly the same vein. But clearly, obviously, you know, if you feel that the response you're getting from me is not satisfactory, then clearly, obviously, members of the public can take it up with their local councillor, or they can write to the relevant portfolio holder. The lead portfolio holder for the local plan is the portfolio holder for Good Growth, Councillor Manroe, although obviously there is, given the new restructuring of cabinet portfolios, quite considerable overlap, and actually that's quite helpful for me insofar as we've now got lots of other people in cabinet who have a direct and a keen interest in the local plan. Climate action portfolio, for example, the portfolio holder for genuinely affordable housing, these are all going to feature, for example, writ large in the local plan. But the portfolio holder with the overall responsibility is Councillor Manroe. In terms of the OMR, I think I've already covered that. I mean, just to say, just on a point of fact, the Ombudsman was wrong that Section 113 of the Localism Act amended at Section 35 of the Planning Compulsory Act 2004 and removed the duty to make an annual monitoring report annual. It was changed to an authorities monitoring report. I say that just to be factually correct, but that doesn't excuse the fact that we should have produced an AMR more recently than we have, and we're working to fix that. And as I say, I hope that you will be mightily impressed with the breadth and scope of the work that we have done. And I would also say that, you know, just because we haven't published an AMR doesn't mean we don't have any data. You know, in response to Libby's very good question earlier, you know, we do have information about permissions, completions and starts, and we can share that. And that will be in the AMR. I have responded to questions from members of the public and councillors where there have been individual data requests, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, Kay, yeah, what?
Sorry, I'm just taking issue with the response regarding the local government ombudsman, because my understanding is that the 2019-20 report should be produced within 3 months of the decision notice, which was the 15th of September. That would make it the 15th of December. So I'm very surprised to hear that we're not going to get it till next year.
Well, I didn't quite say that. So the point that I was making was a straightforward legal clarification. I acknowledge
I understand that. I understand that, but government guidance also says that information from the AMR, it needn't be a single document, but all the relevant information in the AMR should be published at least annually. And that hasn't been the case for 6 years. So,
well, there's a difference between guidance and what, because your original argument was about what the regulations actually prescribe. But anyway, I think we're splitting hairs. At the end of the day, I'm accepting the fact that we should have published the AMR sooner than we have. I've taken steps to rectify that. In terms of complying with the Ombudsman's wishes, as I indicated, that's our firm intention if we're able to. But there are certain factors which are outside my control, because we are relying on resolving some data issues which involved City Hall. And I'd like to say that Ealing is the only authority that is currently having difficulties accessing reports and data from the data hub. But this is actually a problem which is pan-London. Our problem is greater than most because we have a bigger backlog of AMRs to be able to deal with, so therefore it magnifies the problem. But you will find that other local planning authorities may find difficulty publishing an AMR as timely as perhaps they have done in the past because of some of those issues. But we're working really hard with the GLA to overcome some of those problems. And certainly if we're unable to get something out before Christmas, I would hope that it will be as soon as we possibly can otherwise. And the point that you make, which, you know, again, just to underscore this point, is a really good one. The information is really important because it's not just because we need to publish something to meet some regulation or satisfy an ombudsman. It is because we actually need the evidence as part of our emerging local plan. It's a key metric in terms of feeding into our assessment for future spatial options and site assessments, for example. So, you know, I'm as frustrated as you are at not having a detailed, you know, answer at the flick of a switch. But, you know, to say that we have no data and there is nothing that we can share, that is also simply not true. And we'll certainly be able to share what we do have in the coming few weeks.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, just to sum up then, I think first of all to cover, you know, Kay's complaint about her sort of comments not being recorded. I think you know, Katie is taking notes of this exchange, and we've also got the written version of your statement that you've submitted. So I think we can ensure that all of that is recorded with the minutes of this meeting, both your statement and the and Steve's response to the questions. So I take it that that's okay, Katie, unless you you know, have any reason why we can't do that.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess all the. Okay, is there anyone else? I can't see any hands up, but I appear to have a problem with that. So is there anyone?
My hand's up, Paul. It's Linda.
Oh, right. I can't see it, but okay, please go ahead and ask again your question, or make a contribution if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a few bits here. So the first one is you mentioned, Steve, that one of the areas will be about the climate bit, one of the meetings will be, but I didn't see any evidence, forgive me if I missed it, that we would actually checking, etc., with our climate and at a separate meeting, a scrutiny panel actually asked that question, and the answer was absolutely, that we would be making sure that our local plan was seamless with our own climate strategy, which has got some very clear metrics about what our local plan should do. So I'd like that to be built into the evidence base and to the work programme, if that's not a problem. The second one is just to reinforce something. I think it was Kay said, the Manor Road thing. The basis of their claim was about us not having a local plan. So again, at some point in this meeting schedule, can we address what's going to happen between now and 2024 about planning applications that come forward and what we're going to do about that? Otherwise, our local plan could actually be a wasted effort if a whole load of planning applications come in before. So I'm sure quite quickly with our local planning process, we'll have some principles. And so I'd like pretty soon, maybe at the next meeting, some very clear steer on what happens to things that come in, given it's going to take us a long time to come up with a local plan. And my third thing is on the evidence base, that can we also make sure that we've got evidence, particularly around private housing, about what's happening in neighbourhood boroughs and between us and central London, so that we're not build, for example, how much housing is not being sold or being sold at price, so that we're clear that we're not building lots of private housing. The private housing that sometimes subsidises social housing isn't being built for no reason or becomes white elephants. So, sorry, very quickly, and I'm happy to put these in writing to you. One is that in the work programme, we're clear that this is seamless with our climate strategy. Secondly, that we're clear about in the evidence base about what other housing there is in other boroughs that is unsold, as much as we can find that out. And thirdly, probably most importantly, is what happens to plans that come forward between now and 2024.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Okay, Steve, there's some quite big questions there, but I'll give you a go.
Really good questions. I mean, on the climate change, I can certainly give that assurance. In fact, in terms of the climate strategy, members of my team wrote the relevant planning actions that were written into that strategy. And of course, Jo Mortensen and her colleagues and the local plan team are now all part of the same economic growth division under Conor McDonough in the Place Directorate. So we're talking to colleagues on climate change all of the time. As I indicated earlier, we are required to do an integrated impact assessment of the local plan. And so, you know, that's assessing, for example, sustainability appraisal. So the golden thread of climate change, climate action is going to be something which will be tested and not just, you know, at the end of the plan, but throughout the formulation and drawing up of planning policy. So I can certainly give that assurance. In terms of, well, we can't wait for 2024, you know, what happens beforehand? Well, there are two bits to that answer. Firstly, obviously an adopted plan has the full weight and materiality that you would expect of a plan that has been through multiple rounds of public consultation and, most importantly, an examination process. So that obviously has the highest weight. But when we get out to formal consultation in the summer of next year, even though those initial proposals will be a draft, it has some materiality, it has some weight. And so therefore colleagues in the development management team can start to draw on the body of policy that we develop and that we publish as part of that process. They can't rely on it to the same degree they would be able to an adopted plan, but it has some materiality. And again, the analogy for that is the London plan, which has been through some awful machinations, it seems, over the last few years as it's wended its way through the system. And some of those policies have changed quite dramatically as a result of the deliberations that have taken place. But you know, we were able to give materiality, we were able to give weight to policies in the emerging London plan, even though it had not yet been published or adopted. On the specifics, though, we are working on a very detailed housing design guide, including some additional guidance on things like tall buildings, amongst other things. Indeed, our next meeting in the cycle, should you approve it, We'll be looking at these things in enormous detail. And I'm also intending that we should produce a position statement subject to sign off by Cabinet, which will restate our policy in relation to tall buildings. So watch this space. There is drafts currently in preparation, and we're hoping to be able to publish those in the coming weeks or month. And in terms of neighbouring authorities, as I indicated before, we work very closely, particularly with neighbours in the West London Alliance. In fact, we do quite a lot of joint evidence-based work because some of these strategic planning matters don't respect borough boundaries, and indeed part of our own local planning authority, there is a separate entity which has responsibility for local plan making in that part of the world, North Acton, Park Royal. So we are always talking to the neighbours and ensuring that our concerns, our interests are met. And indeed, there is comparative data which is produced on that. So if there are particular areas of concern or interest, again, let's deal with those outside this meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay. Again, I can't see anyone's hand, but I seem to be able to see my own hand if I put it up, but nobody else's. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question before we move on to the work programme? Okay, let's. No one's shouting out, so let's move on to the future work programme then. Shall we just go through the meetings one by one, and people can add any comments on them, and then sort of say if there's anything that they think's not being covered that they'd like to be to add or whatever. So the first one we've got scheduled, not for 14th of October, so not far away now, is on design, and I think we've already got a number of speakers potentially lined up for that, and it's quite a big topic, obviously, including amongst other things that sort of housing design guide. And the whole sort of tall buildings issue. Anyone got any questions or any comments, any ideas for speakers or something on design, or are we happy to proceed with that one?
Yes, I think that's Chair. That's quite important subject to design. Yeah, and I'm sure London urban design. If anyone can come from London urban design, I think that could be helpful. There are lots of work they are doing it, as Steve knows about that.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Tariq. I guess, Steve, are you noting down any suggestions? Obviously, if people do have suggestions, for speakers and things for any of these meetings, you can send them directly to Steve, and so you don't have to just make them mention them at this meeting. Okay, if we're agreed that on design, then okay. Number 2 on 23rd of November, climate action.
Yes, I think that's a good and very important one, Chair, that is sort of crucial and really does sit in the middle of everything. Of course, as we have declared the climate emergency, and obviously the building it well publicised that this is an area that plays an important role and gives off a lot of emissions. So I think it's an important one to look at and get in some detail as well.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Shaw. Okay, no one else has anything urgent to add on climate action. So number 3, which is the one just before Christmas, 16th of December, on green infrastructure. Okay, please just shout out if you want to say something.
We are agreed on that, Chair. It's a very important thing to protect the green spaces and our green area or green belt or whatever. I think there will be opportunity to discuss and rethink about green spaces and greenland.
Yeah, and perhaps golf courses and all sorts of other green spaces.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, no. It's one of the many types of green space that we might possibly discuss. Okay, shall I move on to then the next one, 20th of January, employment, business and industry.
Yes, no, I agree with that one, Chair, as well. And again, you know, I mean, these are all important. I mean, this sort of sits at the heart of what sort of borough we want to look at developing in the future, and making sure that there are good employment and industrial opportunities for residents, that they don't have to necessarily travel, you know, half an hour or an hour into the centre of London or Canary Wharf, perhaps, but make sure that there are opportunities and people can live and work within the borough.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Shaw. Okay, and the next one. Oh, sorry, did someone want to say something on this one? No, okay. The next one, 22nd of February, on housing. I'm sure we'd all agree that that's quite a hefty topic that we need to do justice to. Anyone want to sort of raise any issue on housing?
No, none at all. I would anticipate that could be a long meeting.
Yeah, difficult to cram it all into one meeting, but yeah, we'll try. Okay, well, the last one that we've got on the schedule then, 22nd of March, infrastructure delivery and promoting healthy lives.
Yes, Chair, right. Can I just contribute? Yeah, that's the
Yes,
very
please go ahead, Councillor Mahmood.
Yeah, that's very important bit, Chair, and that's one of the growing concern in the local community and local residents, to not putting the right infrastructure, or not putting road infrastructure or social infrastructure, and developing a lots of building. So I think that's very crucial. That's very growing concern in the London Borough, for the residents of our borough. So I think, yeah, I think that could be a good topic.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Mahmood. Anyone wants to add anything on infrastructure? It is again a big topic. I think the definition of infrastructure is very, very broad. It doesn't just include transport; it also includes things like health and numerous other things. They're all under the heading of infrastructure.
Agreed, Chair.
Okay.
Yes, fully agree with this.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's the last one on the list of topics that we've got. Are there any? Do people have any general comments? Are there any particular speakers that they think they should be covered, or any sort of specific sort of issues that they want a speaker on, or they want to be covered at any of those meetings? While people have got a chance to say so.
Just very quickly, are we sure? Sorry, Paul, is that okay?
Yep, that's fine. Go ahead.
Are we sure that we've got enough, either in the meetings or outside the meetings, on the best ways to engage with the public? Because I think that's going to be really crucial, is that we address how we're engaging with the public, and making sure that we're using absolute best practice in terms of doing that.
Okay. Well, Steve, we've got to produce a community engagement plan, or I can't remember the name. Is it that's being produced, isn't it, as part of the fairly soon? Would there be an opportunity at one of those meetings for us to review the community engagement strategy before it's finally published?
Well, there's a statement of community involvement. Possibly more interesting will be possibly more interesting will be our consultation and engagement strategy generally, and our specific plans, particularly for this an initial high-level phase. But we're also developing quite a detailed plan to accompany Reg 18, the initial proposals in the summer. So there's quite a lot of detailed work being done. What I would suggest, Chair, obviously these are our main topics. These will be the main items for the committee to discuss. But what I would suggest is that we also receive any updates from me or the team on other work or activities outside the scope of those particular subject matters, so that we're continuing reporting back to you in terms of other activities. And certainly the whole theme of community engagement and consultation certainly is something which is within your terms of reference, and I would certainly welcome feedback and comment. So we can cover that as part of the umbrella covering report that we table in advance of the actual committee meeting, and then it's, again, we can agree the formal agenda and the timings we then spend on each item, as we do normally with you, Chair, as part of the pre-agenda meeting. So if you have particular requests or desire to have additional cameos or additional themes, we can accommodate that.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, so perhaps you can minute that yeah, I think we'll put community engagement as an item for, as one of the kind of subsidiary items on one of these meetings when it's appropriate. So we'll get a chance to discuss that. Is that okay, Linda? Is that what you were looking for? I think you're still muted, Councillor Burke. I just wondered if
sorry, yes, yeah,
if that was, yeah, okay, that's good, thanks.
If I could come in, please, Chair.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
If that's okay. I just think on this point, I think it's also just working, and I don't know if Steve might have a couple of comments just on the community review panel that was being recruited in the summer, that was sort of quite a recent announcement, and just where that all sits in as part of this process for the local plan. I don't know if it's entirely appropriate to go into great detail right now, but I'm sure it will sort of run throughout all of these topics.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Councillor, sure. I believe an update on that very topic is planned for our next meeting on design, but perhaps Steve can sort of confirm or elaborate on that if he wants to.
That's right. So we're going to get our consultants frame, who are responsible not just for administering the CRP, but also the DRP, to give an update. So I can assure you, Councillor, both DRP and CRP are now up and running. They've had their first, the CRP has had its first meeting. DRP has had several cycles of meeting, working very successfully, really excited by the interest and enthusiasm of the people that have volunteered for those roles. So we'll be able to give you a much more detailed update, an opportunity for you to ask questions about the detail at the next meeting.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Councillor Shaw. Right, is there anyone else has a last contribution they want to, a last question or anything they want to say? Okay, I can't see any hands, but I can never see any hands for some reason, but nobody's shouting out. So I'll just thank everyone, especially Steve, for sort of doing all of the or most of the speaking tonight. So at future meetings we'll have a number of speakers to share the platform. But tonight it's been kind of sort of Steve's show really. So thanks to that, and thanks for all the members, and thanks for the members of the public, to sort of Kay and Libby, if they're sort of still here, for their contributions. And the next meeting is on 14th of October, and we're going to be discussing design. So hopefully be seeing all of you, or most of you, then. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. See you shortly.